Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
Some years ago, there stood, within 30 miles of my home, a farmhouse with an evil reputation. Personally, I had never visited the place, but I'd heard various versions of local gossip concerning it. Then, one day, when 3 friends called to see me, the subject of hauntings arose. Perhaps it was the wind shaking the windows and the raindrops dashing down the chimney to sizzle in contact with the fire that turned our thoughts to the supernatural. I mentioned the farmhouse, then suddenly, without further thinking, I heard myself saying to Burns, "I dare you to spend the night in it with me." There was a moment of silence as 3 pairs of eyes looked at me with surprise. "Are you serious?" Burns asked. "Course. You say you're interested in the unknown, so now's your chance to find out. It's empty, so there shouldn't be any difficulty." As I spoke and enlarged on the possibilities, my enthusiasm for the adventure increased, and I could see that Burns was equally excited. It was arranged that we would keep notes and report our findings to Neville and Jarrett, the other 2 of the group. So we went, Burns and I, together with Sam, my boxer dog, in my old car to see the place and get data about the proceedings. At the local estate agents, where we called for the key, we learned that the house itself only dated from Victorian times, but it had been built on the foundations of a building of a much earlier date. The centre of the disturbance was the kitchen, out of which there was a door leading into a cave which tunnelled into the hill standing at the back of the house. What the place was originally seemed to have been lost in the mists of time. I've heard said that it was originally a hospital, a burial place for plague victims, and a hidey-hole in the Wars of the Roses, among many other things, said the agent. The family that built the present house used it as a storeroom, a kind of ice house, I reckon. Anyhow, they had terrible luck, what with the crops failing, 2 of their children dying, and the final blow of the mother being taken to a mental asylum. After they had gone, no one stayed very long, and the talk grew amongst the locals of weird things happening, though the cave door had been blocked up. There was a long period when it stood empty, though it's excellent arable land. Then old Gregson took it, a good farmer, but a silent, soured man. He lived alone except for a woman who went in twice a week to clean. One of his first actions on taking over was to unbar the cave door and use it as a storeroom. No one knows what happened, but the woman found him dead one morning on the kitchen floor, with a look of terror on his face. He had evidently come from the cave, for the door stood wide open. Since then, the house has stood empty. No one will go near it at night, though I leased the fields to a local farmer. I'm seriously thinking of having the place demolished, but in the meantime, you're welcome to investigate." "But what is it that happens?" I asked. "Don't know," was the reply. "Either folks have been too scared to talk, or they haven't lived to tell the tale. So it's for you to find out." The house, built against the hill, stood in a silent hollow surrounded by trees. There was an atmosphere of damp and decay. Burns unlocked the kitchen door and we went in. Sam refused to enter and trotted off to inspect the yard. The kitchen was typically Victorian, bare, save for a broken chair and a couple of empty boxes. Besides a rusty range, there was a stone fireplace near a heavy wooden door which led into the cave. The cave itself, with its stone walls and roof, tunnelled quite a way into the hillside, and the whole place had a horrible, musty smell. I wondered how anyone could use it as a storeroom. Viewed in the fading light of a winter afternoon, it was depressing to a degree. "Well, we've got ourselves a beaut," Burns commented. I agreed. "Are you game to try it out?" I asked. "Course! We'd better arrange a night when we give the key in at the office. We could ask them to leave some wood outside the door so we can make a fire. It might as well be as comfortable as we can," I suggested. So it was arranged that we would go the following Monday. However, on the Saturday I received a telegram from Burns. "Regret cannot make Monday night. Must go home. Father seriously ill." Neville himself had an important engagement that Monday, which he was unable to break, and Jared was away for the weekend. So the question was, should I postpone the whole thing? This I was unwilling to do, as everything had been arranged, and as it was my suggestion in the first place, I felt it was up to me to fulfill my part of the obligation. So I suggested I go alone. I know there'll be no check, but I swear I will put down any facts without embroidery, I said. I'm satisfied on that point, Neville replied, but I don't like the idea. From what both you and Burns have told me, it seems a particularly grim place. I'm not nervous, if that's what you're thinking. Besides, I'll have Sam. So, after some argument, it was agreed I should go alone. If there's anything, I'll try and bring back some proof beyond written words, was my parting statement. Owing to various reasons, I arrived at the farmhouse much later than I intended. Outside the kitchen door, I found the key, some candles, and paper and wood for making a fire. Sam again refused to enter the kitchen, so I let him roam the yard until I had the fire burning brightly. Then I went out and firmly dragged him in by his collar. He made several attempts to get away, but I quickly closed the door, and he lay wedged against it, looking reproachfully at me when he was not whining or scratching at the door trying to get out. I drew the broken chair and one of the empty boxes in front of the fire and commenced to eat the sandwiches and coffee I'd brought with me. I sat on the side of the fireplace facing the closed cave door. On the other case there burnt 2 of the candles. By their light and the glow of the fire, which was now burning brightly, the room appeared quite well lit. Sam still refused to come away from the door, despite any enticements on my part. When I had finished eating, I started to make notes of my journey to date. Suddenly, without any apparent reason, both the candles went out, and at the same moment Sam started to howl. "Shut up, you old fool!" I shouted, but to no avail. As I stood up to relight the candles, I saw that the fire was throwing a bright glow onto the opposite wall. As I looked at my own reflection, bending to pick up the matches, I realized there was another figure reflected, as well as my own. At first it was indistinct, but as I watched, it momentarily grew clearer, until a perfect silhouette of a man appeared. It was a hooded figure, not the cowl of a monk, but the close-fitting hood and dress of a medieval soldier. I tore my gaze away to see where he was in the room. It was empty. In vain my eyes searched for his whereabouts, but there was nothing except the monstrous shadow on the wall. As I stared, it started to walk towards my own shadow until it stopped within a yard or so of me. With my heart pounding and my eyes starting from my head, I frantically looked everywhere around the room for some evidence of his presence. I must see him, I thought. He's right here, in front of me. But I could see nothing. My eyes went back to the wall. The shadow now raised an arm, and to my horror, I saw that his hand held a dagger. In the split second as it plunged downwards, 2 things happened. Sam gave a strangled yell, and I felt a thunderous blow on my chest, after which I knew no more. When I came to, I found I was lying on the floor with a wetness on my cheek, while something was pulling at my trouser leg. It took me a moment to realize Sam had been licking my face and was now trying to drag me towards the yard door. "It's all right, boy," I said, patting him, meanwhile feeling for any effects of the blow on my chest. I had no pain, and appeared to be suffering no ill effects. I thought I must have passed out for a considerable time, as the fire had burnt to a glow. It was therefore with intense surprise I saw, when I had relit the candles, that it was only a few minutes since I had looked at my watch. The room felt cold, and there was an appalling stench coming from the cave, the door of which stood wide open. I kicked it shut, then went to pick up a log to replenish the fire. But that was never done, for at that instant some inner voice seemed to tell me to get out as quickly as I could. I ran across the room, grabbed my coat, and hastily put it on as I opened the yard door. Sam rushed through like a rocket. A pause while I blew out the candles, then I was outside, but not before. I had seen the cave door slowly opening. With a sprint, which would have done credit to an Olympic runner, I crossed the yard to the car. I hardly had the door open before Sam was inside. By a miracle, the engine started at once, and then, with no thought as to the car's vintage years, I drove like a madman. If the car had stalled, I think I would have taken to my heels and continued my mad dash to put as much distance as possible between me and that pest hole. It was some miles further on that my heart calmed its furious pounding, and I felt sufficiently composed to take stock of the situation. I thought over what best to do. Visit Neville and tell him what had happened, I decided. I had no proof of my adventure, and as Sam couldn't speak, Neville would have to take my word. But I was sure I could convince him. I drove on until I saw a public phone box. Neville didn't appear surprised to hear my voice, despite the early hour. "I can tell by your voice that you have some news, so come to breakfast," he invited. It was striking 7 o'clock as I rang Neville's bell. I could smell delicious coffee and bacon cooking. On seeing me, Neville said, "You look as if you'd had a rough time, so hang up your coat and I'll ask no questions until you've eaten." As I stood in the kitchen doorway watching him put the finishing touches to the meal, I asked, "Can I have a wash to freshen up?" "Course," he replied. "I'll get you a clean towel." As he turned, he happened to glance at me. His jaw dropped, and his voice came in an awed whisper. "Good God, man! Whatever has happened? Sit here and I'll fetch a brandy and get a doctor." And taking me by the arm, he led me to the chair. "What's the matter?" I asked, bewildered. "Matter?" he asked, sounding in turn bewildered. "How the devil have you driven with that?" Pointing to my chest. Looking down, I saw that my jacket had a hole in it, over the exact spot where I'd felt the blow the previous night. But what terrified me was that around the hole was caked blood, which had obviously come from a serious wound. With trembling fingers, I opened the jacket, only to see that the sleeveless cardigan I wore underneath had the same fearsome stain. Fumbling, I pulled up the cardigan to see once again the stain on my shirt. In my excitement to open the shirt, I pulled off the buttons, but at last my chest was exposed. With unbelieving eyes, I stared at my skin. Not a mark of any sort was to be seen. It was perfect. Then, for the second time within the last few hours, I lost consciousness.
If you enjoy the Classic Ghost Stories podcast and want to support the show, consider becoming a member on Patreon. You'll get early access to episodes, bonus content, and the feeling of helping keep these haunting tales alive. And if YouTube is your preferred place to listen, you can join as a member there instead. No need to sign up for both. It's the same content either way. So, if you'd like to support the podcast and keep the ghostly tales coming, head over to Patreon or join on YouTube. Either way, every membership helps another tale rise from the grave of the past.
That was Phantom Silhouette, not the Phantom Silhouette, as I find myself typing. I don't mean to type it, but the just conjures itself from nowhere, by a lady called Joy Burnett. So I've not been able to find much about Joy Burnett. I found a little bit about her. So we know from the notes, I got this story from A Wave of Fear, a horror anthology by Hugh Lamb, published in 1973. And this story was published in 1971 originally, in the kind of M.R. James fan fiction book that was published by Pardoe. Isn't it weird you have these little lacunae of thought? You can still get them on the internet. There was a whole series of kind of fan fiction, and they were M.R. James pastiches. I've used the story, I think The Catacombs by Shilton was one from that as well. So if you go on eBay, you can still find them. Some of you probably know all about them anyway. So it was first published in that. Scholars and Ghosts and Scholars, 1971. I'm not making a good start here, but that is about right. The lady's called Pardoe. She was the editor. Ghosts and Scholars, and they're M.R. James pastiches, but they're not bad for all that, because there's something to be said for old Monty's style of doing things. And these people, when they write these authors, I don't mean to slag them off, these authors, when they write these things, they produce stories which are not massively M.R. James, but a bit M.R. James. They're more, I would say, they're more classic Gothic fiction, perhaps in a more modern setting. So this was published in 1971. So probably, if you imagine it, the lady who wrote it, she's got the 1960s in her mind because the 70s have just begun. I mean, we always write about our own past, don't we? So even when authors are writing in 2025, the world they're describing actually may be really the world of 10, 20 years ago when they were kind of first experiencing it. Anyway, I think that's a true fact, actually. Anyway, what do I know about her? So she was an actress. She was Australian originally, came to the UK. She is credited as a lady called Joy Burnett, who may well be identical. She is seen from about 1958 to 1988, and she has roles in Studio 4, The Wednesday Play, Steptoe and Son. Sheila said the other day, I was like, Steptoe and Son, as you know, Steptoe and Son. And I said, what? And she said, no, the old one. Oh, the old one. I remember watching that Steptoe and Son with my grandparents back in the 60s when I was a little boy. And, he's horrible. Harold is less horrible, but Steptoe himself is grim. And Sheila says, I'm like him. As if. Anyway, Joy Burnett acted in that. Wednesday Play, Steptoe and Son, Doctor Who, A Night to Remember, and Within These Walls, which was a long-running prison soap opera. And very, very British, those feel like. So she had a number of stories in Lamb's anthology. Remember Hugh Lamb said he was the editor of this anthology, A Wave of Fear. And they were Phantom Silhouette, 71. Was in his book A Wave of Fear, 73, so originally in Ghosts and Scholars, 1971, lifted from that, reprinted in Wave of Fear, hope you're with me. Lot 87 in the Starbuck of Horror, 1975. Marlston Water in the Starbuck of Horror, 1976. Calling Miss Marker in the Thrill of Horror, 1978. So he liked Lamb. He liked that kind of 1970s vibe. So I think that it's the author Joy Burnett and the actress Joy Burnett are the same person. And it's not often that somebody's talented. It does happen in more than one area of artistic endeavor. People are usually really good painters and rubbish opera singers, or fantastic opera singers and don't write much good poetry, or aren't very good at sculpture. But she was an actress and and I think it's a very competent story, actually. It's a slight story in lots of ways, but I think it still works. What are we looking for? I think there's an awful lot to say about this, but I'm probably going to digress from her story a little bit. There's a load of themes when I started looking at it that we could explore, but sometimes you can inflate a story by looking at themes which are greater than the story itself. So it's like blowing into a bag, a paper bag, and you can. We could take this story and look at the human condition, about salvation, punishment, the essence of sin. We could probably draw all of this out of this story, but we might be over-egging the pudding really there, and the story might not be. It's a slight story, as I say. It's a short story, but it works really well. And, it has the characteristics. It has the dog. Thank goodness the dog didn't die. You, like me, were probably thinking, poor old Sam. He's for it. So what actually happened? So in your classic M.R. James story, and in many ghost, if you go back and listen to the ones I've read, like Robert Louis Stevenson's stories, Walter Scott does the odd two, Wilkie Collins, Dickens, of course. But mostly in the ghost story, what happens is the protagonist goes, observes, or even in a frame story, they hear a story and they recount what happened to a friend or somebody like that. But even when they're actually in the supernatural occurrences themselves, they come out of it unscathed. And then something happens sort of in the 70s, 80s, where the ghost story becomes entwined with and becomes the horror story, really. So when we get to people like Ramsey Campbell, fantastic guy, and Clive Barker and people like this, then bad things happen to the protagonists. Usually they don't come out of it alive. And so this belongs to a gentler time. So what actually happens? She goes in, she observes the spooky wooky and nasty woo thing going on, and runs away and lives to tell the tale. Although that's a kind of cool thing about and it's weird because it's written by a woman, and all through, I know the protagonist is a male, and I'm like, oh, well, this doesn't feel quite right. I don't know why. I mean, I write stories with women protagonists, and women authors write ones with men protagonists, and so what, But it just, I was like, I don't know. I had a woman's voice in my head. Don't know. Yeah, with the wound, I'm thinking about that was quite cool. And then the wound, because it's not. But the blood, and I think the other thing, of course, is if we have kind of rules lawyers. I don't know if in most games, you'll have a rules lawyer who will go, aha. However, on page 84, paragraph 7, the rules say this, and we interpret this as meaning that this story didn't work. So you might say that about this wound. So where did the blood come from? Eh? There's no actual wound, hey? But the blood's real. So what's happened? This is some kind of spiritual, it's like ectoplasm, spiritual essence has become matter. Of course, this great, the hard problem there, how mind stuff becomes physical stuff. I'm going to talk about that. Not much, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So anyway, so all I want to say is I think it was a neat story in the American sense, and also the British sense. It was neat in the way it was set up, and of course the things like the dogs going. I love the 1960s idea of sandwiches. You wouldn't have got that in a Victorian story, having a coffee and sandwiches, but it's very. I don't know if other nations do that, but it's a very British thing to do. I mean, if we go out for a walk or a hike, as you might call it, we go up a mountain or go, like nothing better than to take a packed lunch, which is sandwiches. Usually it is cheese and onion sandwiches. That would be me, with horrible white bread, that sliced white stuff that actually probably isn't really bread, a bit of cheese, a bit of onion, a bit of mayonnaise makes it a bit nicer. Actually, it's even nicer if you get nice bread, but by the by, you might have a tomato with you as well. You might have a can of pop or a bottle of pop, and you probably have a packet of crisps. And you might, as a treat, have a chocolate biscuit, maybe a penguin or a Whisper. Or if you're being posh, that's just chocolate itself. But, and that is you. And you have your thermos flask, which keeps you, and usually it'll be tea rather than coffee. But she's obviously forward-thinking because it's coffee she's drinking now. Anyway, I wanted to talk about something absolutely deep. If you're not into the world, the depths of it all, maybe don't listen to this, but just stop. It's not because it's scary, just because you might find it boring. But I don't find it boring. I find it compelling. So I even actually ended up writing a little bit of an essay about this because I got carried away, which has made my production of the this podcast take rather longer than it should have done. Let's have a look at posts. It's called The Soul's Protest, and basically I'm going to run you through it because I think, and this is an example of using this story as a vehicle. The story doesn't really bear this depth of thinking, but it isn't unrelated to this depth of thinking. What made me kind of jump to it was the candle going out. And that seemed to be a really important metaphor for a lot of stuff that's going on. We're going to start at the Enlightenment. Now, some people have commented when I've gone on about the Enlightenment, what's wrong with the Enlightenment? And we have Enlightenment defenders. And I'm one of them. I'm sitting talking to a computer, and I have a phone, and I'm warm, and I'm not hungry. So the Enlightenment has a lot to be, thankful for. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we want to realize that the bathwater is important. If I may have stumbled a little bit there. What am I talking about? Fair point. So let's start with René Descartes. René Descartes, as I used to call him before I started learning French. And he had this idea that he's very famous, cogito ergo sum, cogito ergo sum, if you're going to be classical Latin about it. I think... therefore I am. Now, people have pointed out there's an actual hidden step in that. I. There's no evidence for an I, philosophically, logically. Thinking exists. That's all you can say. But he didn't. He said he smuggled an eye in there, which he's been criticised for, because there's nobody gets out of this place without being criticised. And he says basically the person is made of two substances: a thinking substance, which is mind stuff, and an extended substance, which is matter, which exists in time and space. Okay, so he says that the universe is broken into, there are two kinds of things. This is called dualism. Before that rupture, medieval and Renaissance thought it conceived nature as being alive. René Descartes, interestingly, further on went to say that he actually thought that animals were automata. So there's some dogs about to come up now. I'm just being interrupted. I'm working. They don't care. Can you hear them? You probably... They've had your hairdryer turned on. Oh, no, I've got to stop. Well, it's now a couple of hours later, and what happened was, I'll have to leave the Enlightenment for just a little while. And what happened was that Sheila has her alternative therapy clients coming into the house, and me and the dogs have to be locked away because we're not seemly, because we would create the wrong impression. Dogs may do something, I may do something that would let her down a little bit. So the dogs were locked in the bedroom, and they somehow have switched her hairdryer on. So the room, when she opened it finally after who knows how long, an hour or so, was red hot. The dogs were really thirsty. They went downstairs and drank a load of water. But I'm like, we could have set the whole house on fire. I didn't know the dogs could switch hairdryers on. Anyway, and then I had to go out and take the dogs for a walk, and Sheila came with me, and Jasper, has one of these paw hut dog things, because he's okay at walking, but he gets a bit tired still with his 3 legs. So he rides around like a charioteer in this thing. So we had to go and do that. So now I'm back to talk about the Enlightenment. I would like to just take this opportunity of suggesting or saying that I'm not against the Enlightenment, and certainly I'm not advocating for a return to medieval superstition and religious faith, if you like. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm saying the Enlightenment wasn't a bad thing. I'm saying that there were certain good things, but it's true about life, isn't it? Things are nuanced. So anyway, there we go. Let's get back to the point. So my point really is using this story as a springboard about the issue of, they go in to investigate with a rational mind, and we have she's got a journal. She's going to write down what happens. It's this scientific observation, and this is the Enlightenment project. And my whole point here is that this whole idea was a defense against the dark arts. It was a defense against anxiety. The whole idea of, there are a couple of things to say. First of all is this idea of that we could understand the world, which is the Enlightenment project, is an anxiety defense mechanism. That's my number one point. We have to say something about, after science, Copernicus and Galileo and people like this came along, the church became a bit worried about science, as you know. And it said, and I've said before, it gave this division. It said, anything spiritual is ours, keep your hands off. But you can measure the world. Before, the world was considered as part of, it was God's creation, so it was imbued with, it was creation, Whereas because church and science separated, and it mirrors Descartes' view of an extended thing, which is matter, and which is science's domain, and mind and the spiritual, which is the church's domain. And so these two worlds split apart, and we end up with this dichotomy. And to the end, the science becomes corrosive of religion in its old sense, and it culminates with Nietzsche saying, God is dead and we killed him, which symbolizes the death of the whole world that was based on the meaning of that we were creation, we were part of creation, that we had meaning, we had purpose. Freud, so I'm going to come back to Freud in a minute. Freud said that with his characteristic, I think Freud had a lot going for him, but he wasn't massively modest. And he talked about how there were 3 blows against this world. First is, Galileo and saying that, the Earth is not the center of the universe. Whereas it was considered we humans were the culmination of creation in the view. Therefore, we had meaning, we had centrality. And so science comes along and Copernicus says, no, that's not true, you're not. Then Darwin comes along in the 19th century and says, do you know what, you're just another animal, you're not even special, really. And then the third thing is, Freud says, you're not even master in your own house, you think you're in charge of yourself, but really all you are is a vehicle for animal appetites and passions, which you then have to civilize and repress these this is a key Freudian mechanism, these unacceptable desires to kill people and mate with people just as you fancy it. You can't do that because civilization won't allow it. So, but you have these urges which you have to repress. And so those are the three blows according to Freud. First of all, the Earth is not the center of the universe. Humans are just another animal, and the ego is doing its best to fight against these animal impulses and mostly losing. Okay, so where were we? Then, so the Freudian idea of repression is interesting, and I want to jump to another Freudian idea, which is called the return of the repressed. So basically what Freud says, all this stuff you try and push down, all these urges you push down, come back as, they don't go away, they just come around the corner. Say you push the door closed, they come through the edges and around the corners looking slightly different. And so we have this idea of the return of the repressed, the things we didn't want to think about, the urges we didn't want to have. They come back, and in Freud's terms, come back as, ultimately anxiety, neurosis, perversions, And so what I'm going to say is this, that let's jump back to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment idea is that science, natural philosophy, will allow us to master the universe and make ourselves safe. That's the whole point. We will no longer be at risk of dying of horrible diseases, being, flooded away. We will die. We're not at nature's mercy anymore because science will rescue us from that. So it is legitimate. Those are legitimate anxieties, and science, as its project, the Enlightenment project, is to defend against that anxiety. That's just a description as far as I'm concerned. But what it says is that hidden in that is this premise, this promissory note that you still hear today, is that everything is explicable. Everything, once it's measured, codified, understood, mapped out by observation and measurement. So this is what they're doing in the ghost stories. This is why I'm talking about ghost stories. She goes, or he goes, it's a lady writer, with his candle for the light, with his book to record, and I think that there's a clock involved in it. So he's gonna turn this darkness into measured phenomena, and thus rob it of its fear. And this is the whole, the ghost hunter thing, like the Society for Psychical Research. It's a bit more complex than that, but the idea is that we will, or standard science will say there are no such things as ghosts, there are no spirits, there's no hauntings, and if we can only measure it properly, we will demonstrate through our observations. Are you with me? So enlightenment is all about observations and measurement. Now, what do we need to make observations? So, and the idea and the promise is that if we measure and map everything, we'll understand everything. We will be master of everything. And they still say that. We don't know what dark matter is, but we work it out. We don't know what the hard problem of consciousness is, but we work it out. You just give us enough time and we'll work it out. And my point is that the whole of the Gothic literature is a return of the repressed. It is saying, no, you won't. So if you go back to pre-Enlightenment, you have this idea of the world as a mysterium tremendus, I think. Tremendous, I think. My Latin's a bit dodgy there. Mysterium tremens. Anyway, so it's a huge mystery. It cannot be understood. So the pre-Enlightenment version was that this creation, we cannot understand it. Simply can't. It doesn't matter how much we measure. So the two things are at odds with each other. One says, yeah, we can understand everything, we can master everything, we needn't be frightened of everything, we'll do it. All we need to do is measure it, log it, codify it, map it, right? So Gothic literature. So why I'm using this metaphor of Freud is, in a sense, those dark fears that we try to protect ourselves against through science, fear of pandemics, fear of, all sorts of things. It's just a defense against anxiety. And we have Freud to say that it's not going to work. So it will seep back. It will seep back round the corners. And this is what Gothic horror literature is. It is the darkness seeping round. The things that we've kept out of the light, out of the candlelight, in the darkness, are coming back as our fears and our anxieties, but in a changed form. We don't know what they are. And that's what I'm saying. The whole of the Gothic literature is the repression. We still need this. It's coming back. We can try and hide away from it, but it will come back. Okay. And in the ghost story, these method of observation, what do we have in ghost stories? It's dark. We can't see. There are noises that we can't make sense of. We have, think of M.R. James and people like this, we have manuscripts that we can't trust, or Lovecraft. We have manuscripts, not only in Lovecraft, that we can't trust, which will make us insane. So our writing and our logging is not to be trusted. Our vision is unreliable because the light will go out and we can't see into the darkness. And even time messes up, clocks stop, they strike 13, they strike the hour twice and things like that. So Gothic literature is saying that these acts of observation are not trustworthy. And they are all you've got. The whole Enlightenment project is based on observation, which is based on perception. And Gothic literature says you can't trust that. So what it's saying is the unknowable is going to triumph. You cannot, no matter your promissory note that you've told me that you will work it out, it's not worth the paper it's written on. It's just not true. And the unknowable reigns. And that is I think that's the project of horror literature. That's what it's doing. And you might say that who sits down and thinks of this horror literature? Is it a thing? Does it sit and think? I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I've got a project to show the Enlightenment is wearing emperor's clothes, the emperor's new clothes, Of course it doesn't, because there are, going back to Freud, we think unconsciously, and we think as a species rather than just as individuals as well. There are cultural thoughts, there are group thoughts. A city has a mind in a sense. A community has a personality and a mind. It goes. Think of the madness of crowds. They do things. Nobody in the crowd thinks, I tell you what we'll do this. They have a life of their own, so in a sense they are personalities. In a sense, I could argue that as well, but I haven't got time to do that. So, but the interesting thing about Freud, returning to Freud, I just finished a biography of him called Mortal Secrets by Frank Tallis, which I enjoyed. And his point, he was a great rationalist. Freud wanted the Enlightenment idea of measuring. He looked at the problem of mental illness and anxieties and neurosis and thought, well, if we can only throw light on the darkness, we can understand what's going on, we can name it, we can map it, we can have a model of the process. This is a very scientific thing to do. This is, and this is the whole thrust of modern psychology is to do this, is to turn psychology into a science that's all about numbers and quantification. So, everything has to be turned into numbers to be science, so it can be measured, which again, we could talk about is a real problem actually, because things can't actually be turned into numbers. Numbers are just proxies. These observations are just, it's like mistaking the map for the territory. Alfred Korzybski, he's Polish semiologist, and he said that famously, if it's like me being in the Lake District, looking at the map of the Lake District, thinking that is the mountains. It's not, it's a picture of them. It is not. The map of the London Underground looks nothing like the real London Underground, but it's useful, but it's only a map. So, you see where I am with this. So, but science believes if we map things, it mistakes the map for the territory very often. Anyway, but Freud, I was getting back to a point about Freud. Freud is the great rationalist. But the problem is, despite him wanting so much for it to be a respectable science, it just really isn't, because, the positivists say, psychoanalysis is just a lot of just so stories. Your map of the mind actually may be correct, it may be actually useful and represent a mapping of something, but you can't prove it's unfalsifiable. It cannot be tested experimentally. Therefore, it is not science. It's pseudoscience. And, when you think Freud, he fell out with Jung because he told Carl Jung that we must defend against this black tide of the occult, because he was very much against that. He was very much a rationalist. but ironically very interested in mythology and archaeology and things like that. I'm not talking about Jung, I'm talking about Freud, and very much against this. But if you look at his methods, dream analysis, slips of the tongue, all these kind of observations, they're just like what the sooths. It's like the Oracle of Delphi. Really, it's got far more in common with the consulting sages and oracles and throwing the I Ching than modern science. Which I think those are my 2 points. One is, the first is that the Enlightenment project is about measurement, and Gothic literature shows that measurement, depending on perception, is fallible. Therefore, the whole idea that we will explain everything is cast into doubt. You can argue that. I mean, I'm prepared. I could shout my arguments against that. For that, really, but and somebody make a point in the comments. And the second was just a kind of a takeout, a sidebar, as they call it, about Freud, the great Enlightenment man, whose desperate aim to make psychoanalysis a science revealed the darkness within us that is absolutely not rational or light. So there we are. Very, very interesting. My point is, this is a slight story. It's a good story. I enjoyed it. It was just a jumping off point, particularly with the candle, for me to pontificate about that stuff. But and have a hairdryer incident in the middle of it, and a Jasper chariot ride in the middle of it. But anyway, there we are. Hope you liked that. And there'll be more soon.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they?